At 12:14 a.m. on September 26, 1983, in a dimly lit bunker buried deep beneath the Soviet Union, a single red word began to pulse on a screen. Launch. And in that instant, the fate of the world narrowed to the breathing space between one man's heartbeat and his next decision. Because Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, a quiet, unassuming officer with tired eyes and a mind trained for logic rather than glory, was staring at a warning that said the United States of America had just fired a nuclear missile toward his homeland, and protocol demanded that he report it immediately so that a retaliatory strike could be launched, a chain reaction that would unleash thousands of nuclear warheads, erase cities, poison skies, and rewrite human existence in fire. Yet something inside him resisted, something fragile and stubborn and profoundly human. And to understand why this moment mattered, why this act of disobedience would become one of the most important decisions never officially recognized, we must return to a world balanced on the edge of annihilation, a world where fear was policy and survival depended on machines that could not afford to be wrong. The year was 1983, one of the coldest points of the Cold War, a time when the United States and the Soviet Union no longer merely distrusted each other, but expected betrayal at every turn. When nuclear arsenals had grown so vast that destroying the planet several times over was no longer theoretical, but meticulously planned, and when misunderstandings could be fatal. Because only 3 weeks earlier the Soviet military had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace, killing 269 civilians and igniting international outrage. And just months before that, U.S. President Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire, rhetoric that hardened nerves on both sides. While NATO was preparing a massive military exercise called Able Archer that the Soviets feared could be a cover for a real first strike, and within this atmosphere of paranoia and pressure, Petrov was stationed at Serpukhov 15, a top-secret early warning facility tasked with detecting incoming American missiles using a newly deployed satellite system known as OCO, Eyes in the Sky, technology meant to give the Soviet Union precious minutes to respond before obliteration. Petrov was not supposed to be special, not a hero, not a rebel. He was a mid-level officer filling in for his superior, a man who had trained as an engineer and understood the strengths and weaknesses of complex systems, a man who trusted equations but distrusted absolutes. And on that night his job was simple: monitor the screens, follow the rules, report any confirmed launch. Because in nuclear doctrine, hesitation was death and obedience was survival. When the alarm sounded and the computer reported a single missile launch from the United States, the room snapped in attention, sirens blaring, officers turning toward Petrov, waiting for the order to escalate, and every second that passed without action was a violation, because the system was designed on the assumption that any American first strike would be massive, sudden, and decisive, meant to decapitate Soviet command before it could respond, and therefore the appearance of even one missile was considered the opening blow of Armageddon. But Petrov frowned, his instincts prickling, because the scenario did not make sense. Why would the United States launch a nuclear war with a single missile, practically inviting retaliation before achieving any strategic advantage? And as he weighed this, the screen flashed again. 2 missiles, then 3, then 4, then 5, each alert increasing the pressure, each one tightening the invisible noose around the planet. And now the system declared with maximum confidence that the attack was real. And by the book, Petrov was already late, already disobeying, already risking court-martial or worse. Yet still he hesitated, not out of fear for himself, but out of doubt, because he knew this system was new, untested in real-world conditions, and he knew that satellites, unlike radars, could be fooled by light, by clouds, by reflections, and he remembered warnings during training that the technology was not perfect, that false positives were possible, that human judgment was still required, even though doctrine pretended otherwise. As the officers around him waited, some pale, some rigid, some silently praying, Petrov made a choice that no regulation could guide, a choice rooted not in ideology or loyalty or courage as it is often portrayed, but in reasoning, in probability, in the quiet refusal to surrender agency to a machine. And he picked up the phone and reported the alert as a false alarm, knowing that if he was wrong, he would be remembered not as a man who saved the world, but as the one who doomed it, the man whose doubt allowed nuclear fire to fall unopposed. Minutes stretched like hours as the bunker waited for confirmation from ground-based radar systems. Systems that would detect the physical presence of incoming missiles once they crossed the horizon. And if those radars lit up, it would mean Petrov's hesitation had cost the Soviet Union its chance to respond. And the silence during that wait was the loudest sound Petrov would ever hear. Because every second without radar confirmation strengthened his belief, but also deepened the stakes. And then, finally, the expected radar contacts never appeared. The missiles did not exist, the alarms faded, and the world continued to turn, unaware that it had just come closer to nuclear war than at almost any other moment in history. What had happened, as later investigations revealed, was a freak alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds over North Dakota, confusing the satellite sensors into interpreting the glare as missile launches, a flaw in the system that engineers would later correct. But on that night, the system did exactly what it was programmed to do, and it was a human being who chose not to do what he was programmed to do, and in doing so prevented a catastrophe that no missile defense, no diplomacy, no ideology could have stopped once set in motion. Yet there was no celebration, no commendation, no medals pinned to Petrov's chest, because acknowledging his decision would have meant acknowledging the fallibility of the Soviet early warning system, an admission that could undermine deterrence. And so instead he was quietly reprimanded for failing to properly document the incident. His career stalled, his nerves frayed, and years later he would leave the military, carrying the weight of that night, mostly alone, his story buried under classification and indifference. While history textbooks continue to describe the Cold War as a chess match of leaders and doctrines, not as a fragile series of human judgments made under unbearable pressure. It was not until after the collapse of the Soviet Union that Petrov's role began to surface, when declassified documents and interviews revealed how close the world had come to destruction and how narrowly it had been avoided. And when journalists finally tracked him down, they found not a man eager to claim heroism, but one who insisted he had simply done his job, that he was in the right place at the right time, that someone else might have done the same, even though evidence suggests otherwise, because the system was designed to reward obedience, not skepticism, and because other incidents before and after Petrov's decision show how often humanity relied on luck rather than wisdom, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to false alarms triggered by training tapes or malfunctioning chips. Each one a reminder that the margin for error in nuclear strategy was terrifyingly thin. Petrov's story forces an uncomfortable question that still echoes today. How many times has the world survived, not because of policy or power, but because an individual quietly chose restraint? And what happens when the next decision-maker is less skeptical, more fearful, or more rigidly bound to protocol? Because technology has only grown faster and more autonomous since 1983. And while leaders speak of artificial intelligence and automated defense, Petrov's legacy stands as a warning etched into history's shadow that systems built to protect us can destroy us if we forget to leave room for human judgment. In later years, Petrov would receive belated recognition from international organizations, invited to ceremonies far from the bunker where he once sat, applauded by people who owed their lives to a decision they would never feel, and yet even then he remained uncomfortable with the title of the man who saved the world. Perhaps because he understood better than anyone how fragile that salvation was, how it depended not on heroism in the traditional sense, but on doubt, on the willingness to say, "This doesn't make sense," in a world that demanded certainty. And when he died in 2017, his passing went largely unnoticed, a quiet end for a man whose greatest act was invisible. But the night he disobeyed orders remains one of the most important nights in human history, a moment when the course of civilization hinged not on missiles or presidents or empires, but on a single soldier who chose to trust his mind over the machine, and in doing so reminded us that even in the darkest systems, humanity still matters.